Some things in life are confusing. Take, for instance, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, rational philosopher and mathematician, one of the fathers of calculus. And there's some calculus on the top. If that makes sense to you, good for you. I took calculus in high school. I spent more than a year studying calculus. We actually had an independent study class. There were 6 of us that were in the advanced math, and we worked through the book basically by ourselves. It made sense then. Let me explain to you that I have not used calculus since I graduated from high school. The answer to that perennial question, when will I ever use this? I did not go into the hard sciences, and so no, I've never used calculus again, and now I don't understand it at all. I can't remember that. Algebra I've still got, but beyond that, it's fading. That's the way life goes. But I'm going to read you a little bit from Leibniz the philosopher, his book, his paper entitled Discourse on Metaphysics. What he's trying to do is build a logical system of belief and understanding for the existence of God and the free will of man and the life that we live. It's a lot of stuff. So let me read you just a few paragraphs, and you'll see that just because he went with words sometimes and not symbols doesn't mean he was easy. As the individual concept of each person includes once for all everything which can ever happen to him, in it can be seen the a priori evidence or the reasons for the reality of each event and why one happens sooner than the other. But these events, however certain, are nevertheless contingent, being based on the free choice of God and of his creatures. It is true that their choices always have their reasons, but they incline to the choices under no compulsion of necessity. That's his way of saying God knows the future, but you're free to still make your decisions. That was his way of doing it in the whole paragraph. He continued, "To this I reply that a distinction must be made between that which is certain and that which is necessary. Everyone grants that future contingencies are assured since God foresees them, but we do not say just because of that they are necessary." That's his way of saying that because God knows the future doesn't mean it has to happen. He just knows it. He doesn't make it happen. All right? And then one more paragraph towards his conclusion, and this is where it gets fun. Although God assuredly chooses the best, this does not prevent that which is less perfect from being possible in itself. Although it will never happen, it is not its impossibility, but its imperfection, which causes him to reject it. Now, nothing is necessitated whose opposite is possible. One will then be in a position to satisfy these kinds of difficulties, however great they may appear, provided that he considers well that all contingent propositions have reasons why they are thus rather than otherwise, or indeed that they have proof a priori of their truth, which render them certain and show that the connection of the subject and the predicate in these propositions has its basis in the nature of the one and of the other, but he must further remember that such contingent propositions have not the demonstrations of necessity, since their reasons are founded only on the principle of contingency, or of the existence of things, that is to say, upon that which is, or which appears to be, the best among several things equally possible. Necessary truths, on the other hand, are found upon the principle of contradiction and upon the possibility or impossibility of the essence themselves, without regard here to the free will of God or of creatures. You with me? All right, so that's philosophy. Sometimes it's confusing. This is a book from college. I had a bunch of my notes and highlighting in it. That's the kind of thing that because of my education, I have a minor in philosophy, I can work my way through, but it takes time. You can't just read that and say, oh, I gotcha. You've got to go back and say, okay, what is he talking about? What is it? Because it's a whole system of belief. That's the German rationalists. They were famous for that. Spinoza and Leibniz, you build this giant house of cards and everything builds on everything. You can't just pop in and read a paragraph and say, okay, I'm with you. Some things in life are complicated. Chemistry, physics, women, stuff. that's complicated. I didn't mean to say that, but since it's Valentine's Day, that just came. Watched some, Hey, we watched some Big Bang Theory last night, and they were confused, and I can relate. The Bible has some confusing things in it too, and we're going to take a look at one of them this morning. Mark chapter 7, 24 to 37. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and didn't want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. So this is after Mark relates to us that Jesus declared all foods clean. We've been talking about ceremonial cleanness. We've been talking about tradition. And there Jesus opened the door to the inclusion of the Gentiles in the gospel's outreach. So now Mark is going to share with us the story of a short trip that Jesus makes to a primarily Gentile city, Tyre, and then he's going to be in the vicinity of Sidon later. This is on the Mediterranean coast, north of Judea. Today, this is part of Lebanon. So why the secrecy? Why is Jesus trying to keep his presence secret? For the usual reason, he needs a moment's rest. And I think perhaps Jesus went to this area hoping to get out of the spotlight for a minute, hoping to have a few days where he could teach his disciples, where he could rest, where he could refocus. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. Here we see that Jesus' fame as a healer has spread even this far, even beyond Judea to Tyre. Now, it's interesting because, of course, in the first century, there was no TMZ. There was nothing keeping track of celebrities and important people and where they went. But evidently, word of mouth can be very fast, too, because Jesus has traveled here by foot, and news of his arrival spreads. And as any parent of a child with a debilitating disease would do, this woman rushes to see Jesus in the hope of getting help for her daughter. She falls at his feet. Now, thus far in the text, this is a pretty typical interaction. We see numerous people coming to Jesus, bringing people to Jesus, begging Jesus for healing. Mark has been giving us a series of twists in the story, and here's where this one comes. Verse 26. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. So to you or I, the ethnicity and the nationality of this woman, she's a Greek from Syria, that's her ethnicity and her nationality, that doesn't have a lot of significance. The significance of that doesn't jump off the page to us. Our own society's struggles with racism may or may not help us understand what's going on here. We need to figure out how to relate to what's going on in this text. Why is her ethnicity and nationality important? Now, we know that much of the Roman Empire had a cosmopolitan feel. The multi-ethnic empire that spanned the entire Mediterranean basin and beyond. And we know that in that empire, Greeks in particular were well known. Everybody knew about the Greeks thanks to the empire of Alexander the Great that preceded Rome. By the first century, Greek culture, Greek language and philosophy is dominant throughout much of the world. In fact, we refer to this as the Greco-Roman world. Roman political empire with mostly a Greek religious, philosophical, linguistic, and cultural underpinning. In fact, Greek was the lingua franca. It was the common tongue, the thing that people spoke in order to do business and academics, much like English is today, like Latin was during the Middle Ages in Europe. And that's the group that this woman belongs to. So the empire is cosmopolitan, and we understand that from history. But Judea and the Jewish people were an exception to this rule. They looked at themselves as a holy, a set apart, a separate people, and they resisted attempts to integrate with other people. In fact, before the time of Jesus and up through the destruction of Jerusalem that will be coming in 70 AD, there was an ongoing cultural war. This may feel familiar. There was a culture war going on amongst the Jewish people about whether or not they should retain the cultural pieces of the law of Moses to go along with the law itself. Because many of the Jews were saying, let's accept Greek culture. Let's accept Greek ways of doing things. It's okay. We can still do the Mosaic law, but we can blend in. It was vastly controversial, and you see in the book of Acts that fight going on between the Jewish Christians and the new Gentile Christians as they try to sort that out. So in the first century Jewish community, they went so far as to develop a sense of racial and national superiority over Gentiles. You may not know that the term barbarian comes from the Greeks. The Greeks referred to everyone who didn't speak Greek as saying blah, 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 blah. Their languages were unintelligible to them, so they called them barbarians. The Jews called people that were not part of the law of Moses and part of Judaism simply the uncircumcised. And that was their way of sort of giving them a label that was an insult. It was a derogative term, certainly. But so we understand what was happening in the Roman Empire. We understand what was happening in Judea. But what about Jesus? Here's the key to our text. What about Jesus? How does he feel about all of this? Where does he fit in all of this? Here's where it gets interesting and confusing. 27. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. It's okay to admit that what Jesus says here is unexpected. It's okay to admit that what he just said troubles you. After all, Jesus is the one who welcomes tax collectors and sinners. He's the one that tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. He's the one that met the Samaritan woman at the well. We are not expecting Jesus to refer to a Greek child being tormented by an unclean spirit as a dog that doesn't deserve the meal given to the children. We should be confused. We should be surprised. We should be wondering what is going on. So what are the possible explanations? What is going on here? Well, one possible explanation is that Jesus is just like his contemporaries. He's a product of the culture in which he was raised, and he has bigoted attitudes toward non-Jews just like they do. It's one explanation. A second explanation would be that he's being sarcastic, that this isn't actually an insult. The third one might be that in the ancient Near East, this actually isn't an insult, calling someone a dog. It's not like it is now. There's a culture gap. You just don't get it. A fourth explanation, and these are just the few that I came up with, there might be more, is that Jesus knew what her response would be to this, and so the whole thing is a test. He's not being serious. And the fifth explanation is that Jesus is actually trying to explain something about the Old Covenant, about God's preferential treatment of Israel, whom he calls his children, and how other nations, in comparison to that favor, are dogs waiting for scraps. So it's an explanation of the Old Covenant. Well, we can eliminate that first answer, that Jesus is a racist, because that does not fit the Gospel of Mark in any way. And it certainly does not fit what we understand about Jesus. There are a minority of scholars who are interpreting this passage that way, that are saying that Jesus is just a product of his culture, and he cannot escape it, and he needs to learn not to be a racist. But that's not what Scripture says about Jesus at all, for two important reasons. Number one, Scripture cannot mean what the author didn't intend and what the original audience would have understood. that take on this passage would not make any sense to Mark or to the people the Gentiles that Mark wrote to. So we can't say it means that now when it couldn't mean that then. That's just a principle of biblical interpretation. And the second reason is theologically. We do not believe that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is a mere product of his culture. That he inherited the shortfalls and the shortcomings and the blind spots of his culture. That doesn't make any sense for our theology of the incarnation. So that explanation is not going to work. It's got to be something else. We better figure out what else it is. Well, our second, that it was sarcastic or that it wasn't really an insult, that doesn't work. Because that's ignoring the plain meaning of the text, and we can't do that either. So we're up to 4 and 5. Either this is a test or it's an explanation about the old covenant. And my understanding, my meaning for you this morning is that it's those two things in some measure. So let me think about that a little bit more here. I believe that Jesus is evidently trying to convey a hard truth about the grace of God being first for Abraham's descendants. And he's doing so in a way that is a test of this woman's faith. So I do believe that is the best explanation of this, that Jesus is trying to test her in a way that explains the old covenant, that God has a preferential treatment for Israel, and that is a real thing. Now let's stop for just a moment and step back from this text and remember that there are many things that Jesus says that are hard for us to do. They're not hard for us to understand, they're hard for us to do. When Jesus says, pray for your enemies, when Jesus says, turn the other cheek, we go, yeah, I get you, but I'd rather not. Or I just don't want to. It's not easy. This is the other part of the difficulty of Jesus' teaching. This is the stuff that's hard to understand, not so much in an intellectual sense, because I think we can understand this passage, but in an emotional sense. So let's continue and look at what happens after this, and maybe that will help us get the full perspective of what's going on here, beginning in verse 28. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. This woman's response is both humble and profound. So instead of responding to Jesus' provocative statement, which we believe to be an explanation of the covenant and the test, instead of responding to that with choice words or a hand gesture of some kind, which many of us would probably do, even some of us might do, if someone insulted in your mind your family or your ethnic group or your mother or something like that, you might respond. Instead of that, she responds to Jesus' analogy by highlighting how God's grace overflows beyond the covenant people, which is profoundly wise because it absolutely does that on purpose. It was designed to do that from the beginning. Remember that God said to Abraham, through you all nations will be blessed. And when he was instituting the covenant, the law of Moses, he said to the Israelites, you will be lifted up as my holy people, and it will draw all nations to me. The covenant of Israel was always designed to go beyond the borders of Israel, to shed light in the darkness. Even though God did indeed choose a covenant people, and his covenant people in the old covenant was Israel, and those promises remain in the new covenant, it is the church. But we understand and have always understood that God is still God of the whole world and of all of its people. And that indeed God's grace is sufficient, and that it continues to work to extend his grace to more and more people. So in response to Jesus' statement, this woman demonstrates a profound understanding of the God of Israel. I have no idea where that came from. I don't know what gave her this wisdom or gave her enough faith to hear Jesus' words and say, I will not be deterred. Like the people on the roof who said, we can't get to Jesus, but we're going to rip open the roof and lower him down. Like the man who was, when Jesus walked by and they said, be quiet, and he said, no, and he shouted out even louder, Son of David, have mercy on me. She follows in those footsteps, being someone who will not take no for an answer. So there's something very interesting going on here. Verse 29, then he told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. You see, the Greek woman was right, and Jesus heals her daughter in response. But of course, if you stop and think about this text, this actually just gives us one more question to ponder. Had this woman replied poorly, like Donovan in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, right? Choose the cup of Christ, and he picks the one with all the jewels and drinks it, and that doesn't go well. He doesn't know what the cup of a carpenter looks like. What if she had responded poorly? Was her child's healing contingent upon her response? Now that is a hypothetical, so it's unknowable, but it's a further reminder that when Mark included this episode in his gospel, it was going to be a head-scratcher for us. We were going to have to struggle through it. We were going to have to ponder it. So this second thing that we have to ponder, I'm going to use as an excuse to remind us that it is okay to be confused by God. It is okay if God confuses you from time to time. The great Christian apologist Philip Yancey wrote a book entitled Disappointment with God, a whole book about what happens and how you deal with being disappointed with the things that God does. And then he wrote another book called I Was Just Wondering, full of all those questions that he was wondering. That search for understanding, that willingness to admit that we fall short of knowing what's going on is not a weakness in your faith. That is a strength of your faith. When you know what you don't know and you're willing to admit that you don't understand. When you insist that everything is okay, even if it's not okay. When you insist that you get it when you don't. That's a weakness. That's pride. A second thing that we should note from this text is that we do not need to smooth off Jesus' rough edges. We don't need to try to paint the definitive portrait of Jesus. Let the Gospels speak to us. Let them tell us the difficult things. Because you see, our cultural inheritance as Americans has taken the rough edges off of much of what Jesus says and does. Some of it is because we grew up with some of these stories, and so they don't have much power to shock us anymore because we've known them for so long. And some of it is that we just don't see them as what they really are. And then, of course, lastly, the thing we've probably done the most is sugarcoat Jesus' teaching. We've given it a good spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. You know, when Jesus says, pray for your enemies, it does not really mean all of our enemies, right? We try to find ways to make it a little more palatable. But we need to see Jesus without a filter. We need to see the true portrait of Jesus that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are giving us, and that the scriptures are, as a whole, are sharing with us, including the hard parts. So what happened after this? She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. So we're at the finish line. The how of how we got from there to here is a little bit confusing this time. We have a mother with unexpected, amazing joy at the end. We have a child healed by the power of Jesus. Now, the exact point that Jesus was making by referring to dogs, and that Mark was making by putting this story right here in the gospel, that's important. And we really should struggle and try to figure out what is being said. But don't let that blind us to the secondary truth, or the concurrent truth, that God's mercy is triumphant. That even beyond the land of Judea, even to a Greek Syro-Phoenician woman, that God's mercy was sufficient, and this child was healed, and the prayer was answered. So don't let our confusion get in the way of that part of the story too. I'm going to take this second episode and put it together because there's a similar theme. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee into the region of the Decapolis. So he was briefly in a Gentile area. Mark doesn't tell us how long he was there. Was it days, weeks? We don't know. Now he's traveling back down around the Sea of Galilee. We've been here before. He went to the Decapolis before, and he healed the man with the demon possession, and they ran into the herd of the pigs, and the people told him to go away. This is that same general area. It's the Decapolis is 10 cities, so he may not bump into any of the people he saw before. What's going to happen here? There's some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. Interestingly, Mark is the only one who tells us this story. Mark is the only one who shares this episode. Now, we know the Decapolis is primarily a Gentile area, and so it makes sense if this man is Gentile too, that he would put these two stories next to each other about healings of Gentiles, just after saying that Jesus declared all food clean that we looked at last week. But the text doesn't tell us that. It doesn't tell us anything about this man, his age, his name, his ethnicity, nothing, other than the fact that he's deaf and he can barely talk. So once again, we have a familiar request. And that should remind us, in the Gospels, Jesus heals hundreds of people. And remember that the Gospels are only snapshots of the years that Jesus spent in public ministry. So the vast majority of what Jesus said and did is not recorded, it's just summarized. We've got the Reader's Digest version, which probably means that the total number of people healed by Jesus is thousands, many thousands. If this happened day after day, week after week, people crushing to get to him, trying to get everybody healed, imagine the total number. And amongst those people, the blind, the deaf, the lame, happen again, and again. Not to mention the demon-possessed, which we just saw. So how is this one going to unfold? We've seen a bunch of these, and there's a bunch more coming. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers in the man's ears, then he spit and touched the man's tongue. 9 times out of 10, when Jesus heals, there's not really a process to it, is there? Sometimes he doesn't even touch the person. Sometimes the person isn't even in the vicinity. Every once in a while, we're told that Jesus prays, but he doesn't do a theatrical production with his healings. If you're a fan of the MCU, you know Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange has mystical arts, but he's always doing stuff with his hands to do it, right? Not Jesus. He's no showman, especially when he's healing people. In fact, he's trying not to bring attention to his healing, which is why he took this guy away from the crowd, right? We don't want a spectacle. All right? So in the last few minutes, we were pondering the meaning and the purpose of Jesus' words. What exactly is he trying to say? What does this mean? This one just is odd, right? Why are you touching his ears and his tongue? And why on earth are you spitting? That's the part that's the most confusing. What are you spitting for? Where did he spit? Did he spit on his hands and touch the man's tongue? It doesn't say. It's confusing. 34. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephatha. It's got too many ths in it for English. It's Aramaic, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. So here the mystery continues. Why does he say out loud, be opened? Does he have to say words out loud? Not all the time. He often doesn't say anything. Why the deep sigh? He looks to heaven. That makes sense, right? He often prays to the Father, acknowledges the Father. We're with you there, but what are we sighing about? Mark doesn't explain it. He includes it, but he doesn't explain it. But the guy is fully healed. We still, again, just like the last one, we got where we thought we were going to go. It's just that the journey was a little bit confusing. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone. But the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. You notice I didn't try to explain why Jesus touched the man's ears and eyes. I have no idea. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He's done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Well, here we're back on a little more familiar ground. He does everything well is a callback to Genesis 1:31. God saw all that he was made, and it was very good. I think it's pretty clear that Mark was thinking about that. The deaf hear and the mute speak is a callback to Isaiah 35:6. The mute tongue shouts for joy. One of the reasons why we think that's about Isaiah 35:6 is because this is the only spot in all of the New Testament that word for mute is used. And the only spot in the entire Old Testament that is used is in Isaiah 35:6. And you're saying, wait a minute, the Old Testament's in Hebrew. They can't be using the same word. I know. But in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the only time that word is used is in Isaiah 35:6. So here in his conclusion, Mark reminds us of God the Creator. And Mark reminds us of the Messiah, the Redeemer, that Isaiah is prophesying about. So all's well that ends well. So when we take these two together, the first episode with its questions, the second episode with its unusualness, what do we take from it? Three things I want us to ponder as we walk away from this text. Number one, the theme of God's grace to the Gentiles continues to unfold. Mark is continuing to push forward. The grace of God. It's going beyond the Jews. It's going to the Gentiles too. We've seen that continue to develop here. Secondly, oftentimes simplistic or overly generalized depictions of Jesus are actually leaving out important nuance and depth. We are better off with the whole picture. I get it. We want Jesus that's easy to define, easy to draw a picture of, right? We all just want Jesus sitting with the little children around him. Get it over, make it nice and easy. But that's not the depth of this man. That's not the depth of his wisdom. We need all of it. And then thirdly, and this one's a little bit longer, I couldn't help it. Difficulty in understanding, comprehending, or even accepting a text of Scripture isn't necessarily or need not be problematic. And I put the if in a larger font and I bolded it and I underlined it because I think the if is the key to all this. If it spurs us on toward deeper study, if it reminds us that we don't know as much as we think we do, and if it ultimately leads to wisdom in the end.